Hi, I'm Daniel Zwerdling.
Hi, I'm David Shipler. Two reporters start now.
Hi, Dave.
Hi, Danny. How are you doing?
Great, thanks. And here's our mission today. Ladies and gentlemen, David K. Shipler is going to tell us about his brand new novel.
Ta-da!
Yes, your novel is moving, it's fascinating, and of course, troubling. Tell us the title and give us a quick synopsis.
The title is The Interpreter. It's based on a Vietnamese interpreter at the end of the Vietnam War, which is now coming up to 50 years ago, who tries very hard to stay outside the neat boxes of definition that war imposes on people. He tries to be a patriot that transcends the conflict. And at the end, he's got to make a decision. And that decision is whether to stay in his beloved homeland, Vietnam, or flee to the United States. He has the choice because Vietnamese who worked for Americans, whether for the embassy or for journalists or for private companies, were flown out if they wanted to be in a fairly secret operation. And Lon had to decide. I won't say how it all went down in the end.
No. Don't give away. Don't give away the ending.
But he has that choice. He does face that decision. But it's a critical part of the book because it's a decision that thousands and thousands of people make all over the world, all the time.
Iraq, Afghanistan.
Yeah. And not only interpreters, but people who face danger from gangs.
El Salvador, Mexico.
That's right. Or from natural disasters, to uproot themselves from their countries and try to plant roots in a new place. So this theme, this idea of what goes into that decision, I think is a very important part of this book that transcends the Vietnam War, transcends journalism or the job of a translator. So it's a critical reason that I wrote the book now, because so many people all over the world are facing the same kinds of decisions.
I haven't even said congratulations. I mean, was this sort of like having a baby? Because you've been working on this now for a few years, yes?
Every book is like having a baby. The first one I ever did, mostly I've written nonfiction, was Russia. And when it came out and I held it in my hands, I kept circling around it, going back to look at it. I felt like, the way I felt with a baby, except I'd have to get up in the middle of the night. It's a good feeling. It's obviously a good feeling.
I was a little surprised, actually, by the topic of this novel, because you could have chosen from an endless list of topics to write about. What grabbed you to write about a war that, as you say, ended a little more than 50 years ago, and which many Americans today really don't know much about, especially young people?
Yeah, most Americans weren't alive then. Well, what happened actually was a bit of serendipity. The interpreter who inspired this book was a man I worked with in Vietnam.
And you were there for the New York Times?
Yeah, I was there for the New York Times from 1973 to 1975. I didn't stay right till the end of the war. I was called back in January of 75, 3 months before the end, to New York to study Russian, to go to Moscow for my next assignment. But the interpreter I worked with was a very interesting guy. He called himself a Buffalo Boy because he remembered his youth in the countryside riding water buffaloes and thought of himself as a simple person, although he was quite the opposite. His English was fluent, poetic. He understood so many layers of the conflict in the society. And, interpreters, this is a universal issue. I mean, Danny, you've worked overseas. You worked in Africa. You understand, and everybody who has been a reporter in another country understands how vital the local interpreter and fixer, as we call them, is. I mean, you've got to have somebody good. First of all, you have to have a person who you have faith in. You believe he or she is doing an honest job translating, but also the person is translating not just the words, but the culture. And if you're in a conflict situation, you need somebody who has a kind of streetwise sense of when danger is looming. And I've had experiences in a few places in the world where, my sensitivity was nothing like the sensitivity of the person who was helping me, who could see or feel something going wrong and get us out of there.
And on page 1, from the very first sentence, you already give us a vivid picture of Vietnam, including what it looked like, what much of it still looks like, the sort of corrupt-sounding local commander, a sense of foreboding. Could you read that, please?
Sure. The interpreter's name is Lan, by the way, L-A-N-H. It begins this way. Lan thought he had earned his reputation for street smarts, yet here he was being street dumb, allowing himself to be propelled by the witless American into the dicey checkerboard of rice paddies. The correspondent for the Tribune was pressing forward, all on the word of the paunchy regional commander who, over lunch in Dien Can, had belched his assurances that, yes, government forces had the area completely pacified. No mines lurked beneath the dusty shell-pitted footpath. No menacing Viet Cong hid among the brush lines that bordered the paddies. The refugee settlement beyond was as safe and still as the baking midday sun could make it. So said the slightly poetic regional commander, poetic because of the lyrical seasoning that Lan enjoyed sprinkling into his translations to make his country into a land of metaphors. The path was empty. Not a single child was using a stick to roll the bare rim of a bicycle wheel. No old man balanced a shoulder pole laden with baskets of rice. No young couple rode with a brace of ducks hung over the motorbike. There was no symphony of beckoning cackle calls by women sitting cross-legged behind tarps spread with guavas and durians. Instead, absence ruled with silence.
Wonderful.
Now, the book itself, the idea I got actually was, kind of just by chance. What happened was that the interpreter I worked with died several years ago, and I was quoted in the New York Times obituary, and I got a call from a film producer who said this would make a great film, a great screenplay. Why don't you write the screenplay? I said, I have no idea how to write a screenplay. But the idea kind of sat with me for a while. Good ideas never quite disappear. They hover around you.
Right.
And finally I thought, I know how to write prose, so why don't I try it, writing prose? So that's what I did.
You skipped over something that amazed me. You said when the Times did its obituary, the New York Times hardly does obituaries about anybody, who readers know. It's usually about famous people. But here the New York Times did an obituary about your interpreter.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I think it is extraordinary. Some of us who worked with him suggested it, and we're very happy that it happened. I mean, I actually wrote a piece on my newsletter, my blog, the Shipler Report, about him, and that was also seen, I think, by somebody at the paper. So, I think we should do more of that, or the Times. I say I don't work for the Times anymore, but I think the Times should do much more of that kind of putting the spotlight onto people who are unsung heroes. I mean, they are in the background, they're behind the scenes. I mean, every time you see a story, whether it's in a newspaper or you hear it in a broadcast or you see it on television about a war, you have to understand that there are people behind that story who are risking their lives and struggling with their identities to bring that information to you.
I wish we could have read a novel like this when I was in high school or something, because even though you say that most of it is fictionalized, it's a wonderful way to teach us the history of Vietnam. And I think before we go on, why don't you remind our listeners, especially the younger ones, why did the U.S. go to war in Vietnam? And why did everything go so horribly wrong? Can you give us like a 60-second history?
Well, that's a challenged 60 seconds. But essentially, not to go through the entire history of Vietnam, but, Vietnam was a French colony. And after World War II, the U.S. basically invited France to come back and reoccupy Vietnam. It had been occupied by the Japanese during the Second World War. And ultimately, the French fought a war against Vietnamese communists who were patriots, even though they were allied with communists. The Chinese were helping them and so forth. Well, Vietnam was partitioned into two countries, North Vietnam, communist ruled, and South Vietnam, which was pro-American, pro-Western. And when the North Vietnamese tried to take over the South, the United States felt that the spread of communism around the world was being entertained here. And we were very much afraid of Soviet and Chinese-led communism. So we fought on the side of the South Vietnamese to protect them against the North Vietnamese communists. I think it failed for a lot of reasons. One was that I don't think we understood what the war was really about for the North Vietnamese. It was, first of all, in their minds, an anti-colonialist war. They had kicked out the French, and now they wanted to kick out the Americans. And secondly, it was a kind of a civil war. It was Vietnamese against Vietnamese. And a lot of the Vietnamese in the South sympathized with the North, actually. So we kind of jumped into it without really understanding that. And I think also the way we fought it with conventional weapons, Air Force and tanks and all that kind of stuff.
Massive bombing campaigns.
Massive bombing of the North.
Dropping napalm that burned up the whole countryside.
Yeah, and Agent Orange, which defoliated swaths of Vietnam and have created terrible birth defects now, even into the third generation. It was an asymmetrical war. I mean, the North Vietnamese didn't have planes. They had people on the ground who came down and infiltrated the South. They dug tunnels under American and South Vietnamese military bases. They could come up through those tunnels. And you can visit them today, by the way, the Cu Chi tunnels, if you'd like, to see what they were all about. I mean, they were kind of like the American revolutionaries versus the British. That's kind of the analogy I think of. And the Americans like wars that we're winning, but they don't like wars that we're losing, and we were losing this one, or at least not winning it. And lots of Americans got killed, 50,000 American soldiers, and 2 million to 3 million Vietnamese.
I was astonished in fairly recent history to learn that it was 2 to 3 million Vietnamese died, civilians, fighters.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And of course, a big part of the protest movement in the 60s was about the fact that already then we knew that the American officials were lying about what was going on in Vietnam.
Well, they were. There was no question they were, and we were not winning. We were being, just dragged down. And there was a sense also that we were maybe not legitimately there.
I think one of the powerful things about your novel is that it reminds us that much of this is true, maybe all of it is true of any war that the U.S. gets involved in. Iraq, Afghanistan. As we talk, there's a controversy in the United States about Trump's attack on the Houthi rebels in Yemen. The government is not giving any details about what they really did and what happened as a result. And you do a beautiful job portraying that by focusing on Vietnam. You also do I love how you portray the crazy, really bizarre mosaic of life in Vietnam during this stage. On the one hand, people are killing and getting killed in the jungles. Meanwhile, there are lavish parties in Saigon, the southern capital, where, Americans who are still there are playing at the tennis club in their tennis whites. And there's still this cacophony of life going on. Can you read the top of page 9?
Page 9, yeah.
You and your interpreter are driving down this road crazy with traffic, and anybody listening who's been to Southeast Asia or India or many, many countries will recognize this scene.
Riding back down the coastal highway in the Bureau's dented Fiat, Lan behind the wheel, they sat quietly for a while, pen leafing through his notebook, redoing his scribbled handwriting. Lan negotiated among the bikes laden with large tin boxes, bundles of firewood, baskets of brass shell casings, slabs from wooden ammo boxes, mangosteens, bananas, the newest harvest of rice, and whole families of children wedged between parents, the land's rich bounty mixed into the detritus of war, with nothing discarded and everything put to use.
One of the most vivid pictures for me of being in countries like Vietnam is seeing those families, like on a motorbike, of a husband, wife, and in between, like 5 children.
With stuff piled high, goods they were transporting, selling. And one thing about Vietnam during the war, even at the height of the war, was that commerce went on. They were remarkably and are entrepreneurial people. I remember, and this is in the book too, I do remember an elderly woman buying ammunition crates, empty ammunition crates from South Vietnamese soldiers, artillery units. Then one by one, she'd put them on her back and trudge up a hill or down a hill to a refugee settlement and sell them for a little profit to refugees to break apart and use the wood for their houses.
And I love it that the South Vietnamese soldiers were selling the empty ammo crates.
Of course they were selling them. Never let an opportunity go to waste.
Although most of the characters and events in this book are fiction, you say, you have told me that some of it is based on what really happened to you, very much including the interpreter. As you said when we first started talking, interpreters play such a vital role for journalists. We depend on them to do our reporting when we're overseas, not just journalism, though, but business, big negotiations, negotiating over climate change with foreign leaders. I mean, interpreters play a huge role that's not recognized very much among the public.
That's right. This interpreter in the book named Lan had a particular skill in relaxing people. So in Vietnam, and I think probably in other wars, when an American reporter comes in, people are going to be a little nervous, and they're going to maybe tell the person what they think they want to hear. Well, Lan was very good at going to people first and having the reporter hang back for a few minutes while Lan, relaxed people. He would joke with them. His body language was almost like a dancer. He would gesture, he would laugh, he would make them laugh.
And you talk about his voice being almost musical, the way he would...
Almost lyrical, almost musical. Well, Vietnamese actually is a very musical language anyway. It's a tonal language. But he was able, in his voice, I thought, to convey all kinds of different emotions and ideas and feelings that made people want to tell their stories.
And you're talking now about your real interpreter, yes?
Yeah, the real interpreter who was also reproduced in the novel in just that way. So he was able somehow to ask the questions that I would ask, this is now the reality, but in the novel the same way, that in a way that would not alarm or frighten people. And so they talked, they opened up. Now, in the novel, I made him feel a little ambivalent about that because he was, and this was not necessarily the case in real life, but I made the interpreter feel somewhat conflicted about pulling people's lives up by the roots the way you transplant rice and laying them out for Americans to see. Was this kind of voyeurism? Was this entertainment somehow? Was this going to make any difference for Vietnamese in the long run in terms of how Americans behaved toward Vietnam? These were questions that ran through his mind.
And one of the main questions that runs through his mind is exactly how should he translate what people tell him? I mean, you and I have used interpreters all over the world, and we know you can't translate any language literally word for word, right? Because words have so many shaded meanings.
That's right, and cultural implications, of course, too. But, of course, you need the interpreter to be faithful to what the person is saying, at least the sense of what the person is saying.
Well, which raises one of the main questions for an interpreter, which is what do you do when the person who you're interviewing is inarticulate? Should the interpreter try to say what he or she thinks the person is trying to express? Or do they just give a translation that sounds totally inarticulate?
Well, I would prefer the inarticulate translation. I would prefer it to be as literal as possible. And of course, for Lan, my character in this novel, there are other pressures on him. I mean, there's a Viet Cong agent, an undercover communist agent, who pressures him to distort the translations and to make them more favorable to the communist side. There's a government official who complains a bit about some of the translations. And so, Lan is trying very hard to stay outside the boxes of allegiance that war imposes, and be faithful to the meanings of the words, or as he says at one point, the meaning beyond the word or above the word, which is what you're getting at, Danny, in terms of the sense of what the person is trying to say. But as a reporter, back to real life now, not the fiction, I really wanted my interpreters everywhere I worked to be as articulate or inarticulate as the people they were translating. I didn't want them to embellish what people were saying.
But sometimes you and I got that, sometimes we didn't. You have this great scene where the North Vietnam intelligence agent, who you just mentioned, confronts Lan, the interpreter, at a street stall where they sell pho, that famous Vietnamese soup. He's basically saying to Lan, look, you could choose your words in a way that makes the Americans look better, or you can choose your words in a way that makes the North Vietnamese look better. You need to be patriotic and translate in a way that's best for your country. Please read that section because...
Oh, here it is. I got it. Okay, so I got it. The communist agent is saying to Lan, why do you choose such words? I didn't choose them. They were his words. Lan says, I hope someday you will understand that you chose them, says the communist agent. I don't choose other people's words, Lan says. Oh, really? They are all poets speaking so beautifully? Lan hesitated. Then, with the slightest quaver, I translate what they say. Do you now? Every word is so elevated? And then Lan says, every word has meaning above itself. I give the words true meaning. True meaning? Says the agent. Not literal meaning? I think you are putting gold leaf on a pagoda to hide simplicity.
Well, that passage and others like it made me think of the dozens and dozens of interpreters I've worked with over the decades. And one that came immediately to mind was in the mid-1980s, I was in the desert in Chad. This was during that horrendous famine in the mid-80s where Americans saw pictures of starving Ethiopians.
Yeah.
And I went with my colleague to Chad to convey the fact that Ethiopia wasn't the only place affected by this horrendous drought and famine. It was a huge, huge swath of Africa. So we're out in the desert. It looked like Bible times. You could make a movie there about Moses. And we're interviewing a woman in a hut about how she's coping with the drought. What's she doing to help her family survive? So I have a British woman who speaks good West African French, and she translates my English questions into West African French. Then we have a local man who knew pretty good West African French who translates the questions into the tribal language.
Wow. That
the woman was talking in her thatched hut. So I would ask a question, it would go through many layers of translation, then the answer would come back. And the first problem was that it would be as though I would say, well, what time do you get up in the morning? I mean, I'm making this up. And then the answer would be, I love oranges because I like the fruit.
Yeah, right.
It's like, wait, that's not what I asked. And then the biggest problem that would happen is that the woman would give a long answer. She'd be going on very animatedly, and then the translation would come back. She says life is difficult, but she is trying to survive, period. It's like, wait, she just talked for like 2 minutes. And the opposite would happen, where she would give a 2-word answer, and then the local man would give a very long, flowery answer.
Yeah, well, that's such a problem.
So the interpreter and the woman started arguing just among each other, like they left us out of it. And the British woman, who was a very accomplished development specialist, she turned to me and she said, I'm not really following what's going on, but I think the man is telling the woman that it's improper for her as a woman to be expressing these opinions.
Oh, boy. I think that there's a plus to this, though, and let me just throw that out about the interpreter, which is that if you don't speak the language and if you need an interpreter, you are perhaps, if the person is really good, getting a richer account of the reality than you would get all by yourself if you spoke the language. So in Vietnam, for example, this interpreter is going into situations where an American would have a difficult time making people relax or even understanding what was going on. There are huge cultural differences. And one of them, for example, is one that I write about in the book, which is the smile. Smiles can mean different things in different cultures. And in Vietnam, the smile is often a gesture of discomfort, or it is a mask that covers unhappy feelings. And a good interpreter cuts through that and conveys what is real behind that mask. And I think that's something that a foreigner, even somebody who speaks good Vietnamese, could not have gotten to.
Just to remind everybody, our special guest today is my intrepid co-host, David K. Shipler. We're talking about Dave's new novel, The Interpreter. And Dave, as you've said, a lot of this novel is fiction, which you based on reading histories and on your own imagination. But one of the most shocking dramas in your book really does come from real life. This was a story that you reported for the New York Times.
Yes, it was. Not something I could have imagined, I don't think.
And that is, the reporter in the novel goes to a hospital, I think it is, and interviews a young woman who's been horrendously tortured.
Yes.
Now, when I thought about, did I want you to read some of this passage, I went back and forth, and I was thinking, it's horribly upsetting. I don't want to drag down this chat with something upsetting, except that you told me the other day when we were talking that there's actually kind of a happy ending to this story, if there's a happy ending to any story that involves torture. Can you tell us about what happened and read the passage on page 156?
156. Yes. Well, what happened was that the correspondent gets a tip-off that there's a woman in a hospital who has been terribly tortured.
By whom and for what reason?
Well, the story was that she was picked up by the police as a suspected Viet Cong sympathizer or activist at a market. And, why they picked her up was unknown to her. Maybe a cousin was involved with the Viet Cong. There were a lot of political arrests in South Vietnam that didn't have a lot of common sense to them. If somebody said something about somebody, and the police would go and pick up the person and question the person under torture, really, to try to get information about Viet Cong sympathizers and that sort of thing. So the reasons were not clear to her why she was picked up. So the correspondent, who has the nickname Pen, so he and Lan go in, and she's there shackled to a stretcher on the floor, as if a casualty of combat. And here's the passage. Her legs were covered with a blanket. She looked spent, but she smiled in relief when she saw Pen. "Thank you," she said. "I thought nobody knew." It was always Lan's policy to say clearly that he and Pen were journalists for the Tribune writing an article, never allowing people to assume otherwise. So if this precarious woman imagined that Pen was an authority with the power of rescue, Lan never let her hope take flight. She nodded as if she already knew who Pen was, and expected nothing more than publicity, which might at least make the Saigon regime take care. When she said Saigon regime, quote unquote, Lan knew which side she was on. I have to insert there that in that war there was different vocabulary depending on which side you were on. There were different words for government, for village, for hamlet, for province. I mean, each side had its own lexicon. So you could tell right away. Speaking as softly as possible, Lan collected the scattered fragments of her story. She was 26. In the market one morning, a woman she didn't know came to her, spoke nicely with her for a moment, then walked off. Minutes later, 4 men in plain clothes grabbed her, shoved her into a police van, and took her to an interrogation center in Kien Quang. 2 male policemen led her to a bare room with a metal desk in the corner and several chairs. They told her to get undressed. She refused, so they pulled off her shirt and trousers. They took off her shoes. One beat her with a stick, stinging blows on her chest, back, and stomach. When she cried out, one covered her mouth with his hand. When she started to fall, he yanked her upright by her hair. They attached electrodes to the ends of her 2 index fingers and led the wires from an old cranking telephone. They moved the electrodes, one to her nipple, one to her vulva. Penn did not know it at the time, but American soldiers who used this method had called it the Bell telephone hour. The interrogators shouted, "Confess!" When she did not, they cranked. The shock and pain rippled like a burn through her entire body. When she continued to resist, they covered her mouth and nose with a handkerchief and poured bucket after bucket of soapy water into it. When her belly swelled from the water, they kicked her in the stomach. With their hands under her rib cage, they picked her up and dropped her. They tied her legs apart and kicked between them, she told Lon and Penn, without a flicker of embarrassment. They put a live meter-long eel up her vagina. And as she said this, she winced as if it were being done again. She bled for 10 days straight. They kept taking her back and forth between the hospital and the interrogation room. Now she could barely walk. Penn noticed something. Lon's voice wavered as he translated, this time without his usual poetry. There was no metaphor in what he had Hua saying, just a spare account, as if she had crossed some barrier and left terror behind. She seemed, through Lon, to be looking at herself from the outside. Penn felt a pang of envy at her detachment. He glanced from his notebook to the handcuffs that shackled her right wrist to the bar of the stretcher and saw engraved in the shiny metal, "Made in USA." When her mother entered the room, Hua's steadiness ended. Tears flowed and her whole body shook as her mother bent to hold her as thoroughly as the stretcher and cuffs would allow. Penn stood aside, but he had more questions of the kind he didn't want to ask, to let her affirm or deny her affinity for, quote, the other side. Why did she think the police tortured her? Partly for fun, she said. What are your political views? Before, nothing. Now? Her mother shot her a glance of warning, and Hua said, now I can't say. Min was in Lon's head, editing, and Lon was pushing him away. Then, just inside the door to the room, a man with a worried face appeared. He looked too clean, Penn thought, in a sparkling white shirt and dark trousers. You are not allowed to question a prisoner, he said to Penn. Please come with me. So that did happen. That did happen, actually. I did interview a woman who was shackled in a hospital and described her torture just that way. And what was interesting, as you alluded to, Danny, is that I've kept in touch with her all these years. I went back to Vietnam in 1997, and I got together with her.
Unbelievable.
And had lunch, and she had become a low-level municipal official in the communist government of Ho Chi Minh City.
How did you know how to get in touch with her?
Well, originally I was actually introduced to her not the way it's done in the novel, but through a Mennonite couple who were there doing reporting on the war, and they had contacts among political prisoners, and they told me about her. So that's how I got to know her. And so through them, I was able to reconnect with her.
And this is what I find so mind-blowing. Okay, this woman was horrendously tortured. You find her many years later. You go out for lunch with her. What's she like now?
Well, from what I could tell, she's recovered. I mean, obviously, if you just have lunch with someone, and by the way, we were speaking to each other through an interpreter. So, I don't know how much I can tell you about what happened to her to scar her and whether those scars remained. She seemed fine, and she emails me every holiday period, every Christmas, New Year's.
Really?
To give me greetings. Yeah, and it's quite something. I mean, it's very touching, actually. I think she probably gives me more credit than I deserve for rescuing her.
Well, what did she say to you? Well, what did she say to you?
Well, I don't remember the lunch we had was back in 1997, and I don't honestly remember a lot of the details of the conversation from way back then, except that she told me about her work and was thankful that I had written about her and recovered, and was, in a way, became, because of the story, I guess, in the Times, became somewhat famous among the communist officials of somebody who was a victim and therefore was worthy of some kind of a position in the communist government in the city there. And then the subsequent emails that she sends every year are very brief and just wishing you happy holiday, that sort of thing. And then I send back an email wishing her a happy holiday. And, the most we'll say to each other is, we're okay and, glad to hear from you.
Wow. And you did a series for the New York Times about how the South Vietnamese tortured people, right?
That's right. And actually, that part of the novel is true, that the correspondent then decides this is part of a larger story.
And part of the larger story is that American troops helped teach these torture techniques to the Vietnamese.
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes we're present during torture. I mean, the Bell Telephone Hour story is true, that American troops did call it that. They used these crank telephones. Anyway, so this woman gets, she sends me an email every Christmas and New Year's time and says, happy holidays. So it's one of those kind of unusual, I'd say, relationships because, and if I go back to Vietnam, which I'm hoping to do, I will definitely get in touch with her and sit down with her and see her again. Boy, after you're arrested like that and tortured, that's kind of like a wake up call, isn't it? I mean, that you can really make enemies that way. And the Americans and South Vietnamese government made a lot of enemies.
While you were reading that, I started thinking about something going on right now in the United States, which is not torture in that sense, but the stories we've been hearing in recent weeks about the Trump administration rounding people up, accusing them of being, dangerous criminals while presenting no evidence. And to the contrary, some lawyers are presenting pretty compelling evidence that that's not true, at least in some of the cases. They've been rounded up, forced to bend over in shackles, sent to a horrific prison in El Salvador, where people are essentially tortured. So it's not so far from what's going on in the United States right this second.
Well, that's right. I mean, and we're not even at war, contrary to what Trump says. We're not in a war. We're not in an existential survival mode. I mean, not to excuse the South Vietnamese, but they were terrified of the communists who had a lot of people who expressed affinity for them in the countryside, especially. And I think one of the things that I learned about the whole situation in the process of doing the series on political prisoners and torture was that the arrests were pointless because they didn't seem to be based on any real evidence, just as these arrests and deportations of Venezuelan supposed gang members are based on obviously very thin, contestable evidence, so-called evidence, a tattoo that actually is a tattoo for a Madrid soccer team, that sort of thing, a hand signal in an old 10-year-old post that meant love. I mean, really. And I think that in South Vietnam it was similar. That is, people whose, second cousins might have been in the Viet Cong were arrested and that sort of thing. So that was kind of the situation there, which of course undermines the government's authority. And I think that's kind of what might be happening in the United States as well.
Scary. But let's shift gears for a moment and move to something uplifting. And I'd love to hear, how do you write a novel in the first place? You and I spent most of our careers reporting. We dug up facts. One fact would lead to another. And I've always found that comforting, actually, because I feel that if there is a fact to be found somewhere about something, I'll probably be able to find it. And you and I had a mantra for our careers. We won't write a single word that we can't document and corroborate.
That's right.
So how do you write a novel?
It is a different experience. I think it taps a different part of the brain to write fiction. I find it liberating in the sense that I can make up quotes. I mean, as a journalist, I can't make up quotes. They have to be absolutely precise. But anyway, I think that in a way it's liberating. I understand what you're saying about it's being terrifying because you really rely on your own imagination primarily. So I do draw a lot from my own experience. I would bet you most novelists would say that as they step from reality into unreality, they take bits of reality with them, their own experiences with people they've known, with their own inner thoughts and characters. And so that certainly happened with this book. But I did have the liberating experience of being able to create characters and scenes and episodes that informed the story without being attached to reality in any way. And what I tried to do in this book was to really get inside the mind of the character, of the interpreter, whom I mostly invented. Actually, I've discovered since writing fiction that when I invent a character, I know more about that person than I know about any real person in my life, because I know all about the internal thoughts, the backstory, the foibles, the self-criticisms. I kind of have felt, and I don't know if you would agree with me about this, Danny, or whether many other reporters would, but I've kind of felt that nonfiction can take you only so far in portraying the truth. That there's a deeper truth in any situation, that nonfiction, with its absolute rules about verifiable facts and precise and accurate quotes, just can't quite reach. And that when you live in a country and when you live in a society, whether it's your own or a foreign country, and you get deeply enough into it and you understand things about it that you can't document with a footnote, you can portray in fiction. For example, in this novel, there are dreams, and the dreams are significant. The dreams have meaning. Well, there's no way as a nonfiction writer you can do that unless the person you're interviewing happens to tell you about dreams. But for me, the dreams were very important because I'm getting into inside the mind of the interpreter. I'm getting inside his thoughts.
If I'm understanding you, what you're basically saying is that there are certain really profound truths that we sometimes think we know and do know that you can't convey using normal journalistic rules.
I think that's true because a journalist almost never gets as deep as a novelist gets. I think one of the reasons that some literature is great, I'm not saying this is that it does get at truth in a way that nonfiction can't. I mean, look at Shakespeare and the truths about people's foibles and their conflicts.
And Greek tragedies.
Greek tragedy, for sure. I think that's a great example of how much more accurate, in a way, or thorough. I don't say accurate, but much more thorough and richer literature, great literature can be.
Well, Dave, this has been wonderful. And I think it's time for a shameless plug. I want to urge all you listeners, go out, buy Dave's novel. Tell your loved ones and friends to buy the novel. It's called The Interpreter by David K. Shipler. But before we go, I do want to add that in addition to the really distressing, thought-provoking parts of the novel, and we've talked about some of them, there are parts that read almost like a delightful travelogue. So could you please end on the passage about Nuoc Mam?
Yes, Nuoc Mam is a staple of Vietnamese cuisine.
That's the fish sauce of Vietnam. Anybody who's been to a Vietnamese restaurant in the United States knows how wonderful it is, Nuoc Mam. And you write in your novel, and I discovered this when I went to Vietnam some years ago, that a Nuoc Mam factory can be really disgusting. But fortunately, when you leave Vietnam, you forget and go back to a Vietnamese restaurant and love it all over again. Your passage begins with Lan, the interpreter, getting a big bowl of soup with tripe in it.
Page 18. I'm just... Yeah. Lan suddenly made a private vow to take Pen to a place where they made Nuoc Mam, to see if Pen would be repelled, shocked, and sickened, or would he be hit with stunned admiration at the process of producing the rotten-smelling fish sauce, the amber treasure of Vietnamese cuisine. Add a few circular slices of red peppers when you're about to eat, pour it on your food or dip a slice of pork into it, and make every taste vibrant. Penn had been happily eating Nookmom, but what a wicked test to show him the art of its creation.
Then a little later, you have a passage where Lon actually takes Penn and his wife to the factory.
So they can see how it's done, behind the scenes. The village was humble and sad by its look, but the smell in the pitted street beside the factory was alive and bracing. Inside, the fishy assault slammed Penn and Julie like a putrid storm of ancient decay. "Oh, God!" Julie brought her hand over her nose. "Wow, pretty strong," Penn said, and blinked his stinging eyes. "I'm not sure I can stay here," Julie said softly enough that she hoped Lon hadn't heard. He pretended not to and forced down a smile. Aside from the odor, the visitors found a sweet welcome. The owner greeted Lon like an old friend and presented his daughter, who shook hands as if she were in charge. They walked them proudly through the process. 4 great wooden vats sat atop a platform. From each, a peg-like tiny spout hung over a wooden barrel covered with a circular piece of plywood, open, with a small slice directly below the little pipe. The stench made Penn's eyes water and kept Julie's hand over her nose and mouth. The father and daughter gave the tour like partners in a duet, interweaving their sentences so that Lon's translations had no source but the responding melodies of the mingled voices. First, fish were mashed and put into the upper vats, they explained. Small sardines were preferred, but when the U.S. Navy was here, firing on fishing boats they thought were smuggling weapons for the VC, it had been difficult to get fish from the sea. Using freshwater fish required added salt. The mash of fish and salt fermented in the upper vats for several months, about 6 months, ideally. Julie felt like retching. Penn began to get interested. Then the little spouts were opened, and the liquid drained down into the lower barrels. That liquid was then poured back into the upper vats and allowed to sit for 3 months more. Then drained again, then poured back. The best Nookmom would take a year, the daughter said with a charming smile. Lon was watching his Americans. Julie had to leave, get outside, find some healthy air. Penn was scribbling notes now, thinking of a story. "Amazing," he said. "Fabulous. Something so delicious from all that rotten fish. Who could imagine?" When Lon translated, the father and daughter smiled and bowed in appreciation for the appreciation. "The passage of time seasons all of life," the father said, according to Lon. Penn wondered again how it was that all Vietnamese spoke in poetry. So what? Lon makes the quotes delicious.
David K. Shipler is the author of the brand new novel, The Interpreter.
Well, thanks, Danny. I really appreciate your allowing me to be on our show.
We are honored. Are you going to do an audiobook version?
An audiobook is being done by a wonderful Vietnamese actress.
Wow.
Who has done other books about Vietnam novels, and she is great. And I asked them to try to get her, and they've succeeded. Because we need somebody who can pronounce the Vietnamese words properly, which I cannot.
That's fabulous. Well, that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or pretty much any leading podcast site. And we hope you'll check out more of our work at tworeporters.org. I'm David Tripler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.